Hi everyone, and welcome to another tutorial for the MetaHuman Challenge. And this time I'm going to help with some tips and tricks on setting up a presentation within Unreal Engine 5, posing, setting up a camera, that sort of thing. Now, some of you may be already familiar with another workflow using Maya and creating animation, exporting, and so on. But here I know we're all using Unreal Engine 5, so I thought I'd create a quick tutorial for those that aren't familiar with the sequencer tools, aren't familiar with the camera setups and things like that in Unreal Engine. So I've got a blank level here. Most of you will have already got to this point in getting a character in, setting up lights and things like that. So I'm just going to quickly set up this level so that we have something to look at. So we want to put a couple of lights in there. We've got a couple of lights on Ada. Now you may notice something that's happening here, which is when I look away and then I look back, you'll see that the lighting isn't changing all the time. It's a little trick here where with auto exposure, it works great if you're simulating physical spaces and you're walking around and that sort of thing. For gameplay, it's great. But when it comes to what we're doing here, which is kind of doing marketing shots, I like to turn off auto exposure. So by unchecking that box, so I go into project settings, search auto exposure, uncheck the box. It means that the lighting, when you're doing edits and stuff like that and moving around, the lighting is staying consistent through the whole thing. Right, the next thing we want to do is we want to add a level sequence so we can pose our MetaHuman. So right click in the content browser, cinematics, and add a level sequence. I'm just going to leave it the default name. Then we're going to double click on new level sequence to open up the sequence editor with the sequence in it. We need to add Ada into our track. So this is your typical timeline that you would see in video editing or animation. And in here, we've got nothing to drive yet. So we've got nothing we can keyframe. So what we're going to do is we're going to click Track, Actor to Sequencer, and BP Ada. So what that does is it adds the controls for Ada into the sequencer, and it also shows you the controls within the viewport so we can start to animate Ada. A couple of things that are useful here. Now, depending on whether you're doing a video or an image, may change the way you approach the timeline and how you do keyframes. In this case, I'm only dealing with images. With videos, obviously, when you do your poses and things, you want to do it over time. That's if you want to animate the character. But even the camera, you will want to use a longer timeline and be able to change the position of the camera, rotations, and things like that over time. But for now, I'm just going to use each frame as a single pose. So we're on frame 0 here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on add new keyframe for both of these, the body and the, I've already done that for the body and the face. What that means is frame 0 is always the neutral position. I can also copy those frames and move them somewhere else. There is probably a setting in here for resetting the controls, but I don't know what that is off the top of my head. Having frame 0 set as the neutral position means that I can come back to it and restore neutral if I need to. Right, so I'm just going to pick the next frame. Frame 2 is fine. And I'm going to do a quick pose. Now, this is the control board. If you're not familiar with it, this is pretty standard for facial control rigs based on the facial action coding system. So each one of these dots, circles, provides you with a control for the face. Now, what I'm going to do is I am going to, let's have a play around with a smile. Smile is incredibly hard to do, especially open mouth smiles. If you find that you're really struggling with the open mouth smile, you could just go for a closed mouth smile. It's a bit easier. I highly recommend using reference when you do your smiles, and I also highly recommend having someone else look at the smile as you go, because I find that what happens is you get a little bit tunnel visioned and you think, oh, that smile looks all right. And then when you come back to it or someone else looks at it, they're like, that looks very weird. Right. So I'm just pulling these controls. You can have a play around. Each of these controls do control a different part of the mouth. I have a particular way that I like to do mine. Little bit of jaw open when you're opening the smile that much. Okay. Right. So little trick with the eyes. Cheek raiser. cheek raise is the control that you want to use for the eye squinting. It's not squinting. It's actually your cheeks are raising, not your eyes squinting. So we want to use the cheek raiser control to get that smiley eyes. Quick little tweaks. I think I've got too much eye smiling. There we go. Little asymmetric brow raise. Let's do that. Okay, so I've changed a bunch of controls. Now there's this one here, which is auto keying. As you change the controls, it auto keys. And that means every time you change a control, the keyframe on the frame that you're currently on, a keyframe will be added automatically, which is good because you don't want to pause it and then scrub back to frame 0 and you haven't keyframed on frame 1, you will lose all your changes. So make sure you keyframe. Now, the other way you can be sure of your keyframing is you can go back to the top of here, click that button, and it just keyframes all of the things. So just to be sure. So I can now scrub between 0 and 1, and you'll see that I have a different pose. Now, if you want to try a different pose, you just move on to keyframe frame 2, and then add more poses in there. Right, now that we've got that, the next thing we want to do is add a camera. So you could take images in the editor, but you want to use a cinematic camera to give you more control over the camera. And the cinematic camera is more akin to, well, a cinematic camera. So you can use some of the real world concepts to do your camera setup. So this button here, the little camera, this is what creates a camera in the scene, in your sequence. And when you first create it, it automatically goes into pilot mode. And we can move around using WASD and the mouse controls, holding right click, and we can find a position for the camera. So let's just do some sort of 3/4 shot. Now you'll notice that it's out of focus at the moment. So with the Cine Camera Actor selected, click on the Details panel, the Details tab, and now we've got a bunch of controls for it. First of all, we've got the film back. Digital film's probably fine. So this determines your aspect ratio for your camera. So for your images. So we've got a 16:9 digital SLR. You've got a full frame DSLR. So the main thing you want to be aware of is just affects your aspect ratio. So I would probably just go with a 16:9, a digital SLR. Then you know you've got 16:9. Right. So focus. The best way to do the focus is to enable the debug focus plane. And in the distance, there'll be a little purple plane. And as you drag that to the left, you're bringing it closer to you. Further to the right is away from you. And you'll see that the plane overlaps the digital human. So the idea is wherever the plane is where you're focusing, where your camera's focusing. So I like to focus sort of around the eye line. Okay. Once I've got it there, I turn off the debug focus plane, and now you'll see that her face is nice and crisp. The other thing we can do is we can go down here. We've got, oh, I forgot to change the focal length. I should do that first. We've got the aperture. So the aperture, in simple terms, the larger the number, the more stuff is in focus. The shorter the number, the lower the number, the less stuff is in focus. So if you want that shallow depth of field look, you want to run with a lower aperture. So 2.8 is already pretty low. Actual camera lenses, like good camera lenses, can go down like to 1.2, 1.4 is reasonably common, but 1.2 and 1 for like extreme lenses, they can be extremely shallow. So what we can do is 2.8 is probably okay. We could maybe make it a little bit shallower. We don't have to deal with physical cameras, so you can set it to whatever aperture, so physical lenses, so you can just set it to whatever aperture that works for you. The other thing is the focal length. So the focal length, we generally use a more telephoto lens, so that means a longer focal length, a higher number focal length. And that gives us that sort of flattening of features, and it's more appealing to look at. It's more aesthetically pleasing. As you can see, as I increase the focal length, it kind of zooms in or flattens the image as well. It zooms in and flattens the image. So now I need to move the camera back a touch because I'm too close. Right. And we want to think about the composition as well. We've got there. We're out of focus again, so I need to just adjust that focal focus plane. Once again, we're just using that focal plane to help us with that. And now we have a reasonable composition. Now, if you look at this, her right eye is out of focus. So what I've done is I have made the aperture too low. So let's make it a little bit higher. 4. Press G to turn off all the rig controls and things. It's not bad, but I probably want to have a little bit more in focus. So we're just going to go with 8. Okay. Pressed F10 by accident. That changed my layout. That confused me for a minute. We're okay. All right, so now we've got the camera. Now we've got the pose. What we want to do now is we want to capture the image. So to capture the image, there are different ways you can do it. I think the easiest way to do a screenshot, and this is what I usually do when we do marketing shots for work, for Unique, is I will just take a screenshot using the high resolution screenshot tool. And that's in the burger menu here. So we click on the little burger menu, and then we go down to high resolution screenshot. And then here we've got some controls, and we can change the screenshot multiplier to whatever works best. I'm just going to stick with 1. It multiplies the resolution of your viewport. So this will actually be quite small, I think, because it's going to be just a little viewport. There you go. See, it's on the viewport. So what you should do is, first of all, you'll want to pilot the camera. So I could be all the way over here. I don't want a screenshot of this. I want a screenshot from the perspective of the camera. So click on this little button here, and it possesses the camera. So you're piloting the camera. Click on the viewport, F11 to full screen it. And then now we take a screenshot multiplier of 1, and that will be a full 1-to-1 resolution of whatever your viewport is. Now, if you want to make the resolution higher, just increase that number, 2, 3, that sort of thing. But you shouldn't need to go that high. 2 is probably sufficient. It depends on your screen size. So that's how we get a shot. So now we've got a single shot of Ada, and that's great. What you may like to do is you may want different shots. So in which case, just keep adding cameras. You can keep adding cameras, and then you have different angles and things like that. So when you modify your MetaHuman and you want to do another set of shots, your poses are already there, your camera shots are already there, your lighting's already there. So it's easy for you to kind of spit out a whole bunch of screenshots. Now, videos. If you want to do a video, here's how we do it. We create another camera, and what we're going to do is we're going to set up this camera again. So we're going to set up the focus, and then I've got the focus set up. I'm okay with the transform that we've got here. I could move it around a little bit more, but let's just say I'm happy with this. So we click on the keyframe button for the manual focus. So set the focus. I've set the transform here, like the location of the camera and the rotation. I'm happy with that right now. So now what we want to do is we want to go into the future on the timeline, and I want to determine where I want the camera to be at the next, at frame 120. Okay, so we click on frame 120, and I go, where do we want the camera to be in frame 120? So let's say we move the camera over here. Maybe it zooms in a little bit. Not too much. Now, because I'm auto keyframing, you'll see that it's automatically added a keyframe for me when I move the camera. So that's quite handy. If it doesn't do that for you, or you don't have that on, because sometimes you can overwrite like your existing frames if you do things in the wrong order. So if you've got that off, click this button and it adds a keyframe. Now I may need to tweak the focus, which I do, and I focus on her face, and then I click that button to do the focus as well. Now, when I turn off the debug, now when I drag the slider, you'll see that we have a little sort of panning motion there. So a dolly and a pan. So that is how you do a cinematic, is you just keep stringing these keyframes together. You can keep adding keyframes. So we could move around here and add another keyframe. Now, as you start adding keyframes in between existing keyframes, things start to get a bit wonky. You got to follow the curve of how the camera moves and things like that. So if you're not familiar with animation, then I would suggest that you do what I just did, is you start with your first position, have a second position, and then you just set the keyframes at first position, second position, and you have a very simple camera move. You can do much more complicated things, of course, if you want to play with it, but that is a simple way of getting camera moves. So that concludes this tutorial. Hopefully there's a few little tips and tricks in there that might help you with presenting your MetaHuman for the challenge a little bit better. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys create. We've already started having a few submissions, so keep up the good work, keep working hard, and we'll see the final submission soon. Cheers.